what happens is your body, you have to get there slowly, right, with a very long, slow taper. But once you get to that high dose, people can take all the other fast-acting opiates they want, right? So I can shoot up heroin, it won't do a thing, right? And very quickly you realize it's a giant waste of money, it doesn't help anything, and you don't have withdrawal, there's no reason to keep taking it, and so you don't, right? It doesn't do anything anyway. So you very, very quickly stop, and very, very effectively, because you get you get no effect of the drug use. The way I think of it, this is basically locking all of your opiate receptors on. If they're locked on, they can't transmit any information, right? Because the information gets transmitted when there's a change. You can't tell anything about your environment if all your receptors are locked in the on position. So the particularly useful thing of opiate agonist treatment, and part of the reason why it's so dang effective, is it has in it a pharmacological adherence mechanism, is the way that I like to think about it. So long as patients are on that high dose of methadone or buprenorphine, they will become tolerant and they will become physically dependent, right? So if they decide to not take their medications on that day, so that they can unlock their opiate receptors so that they could take some heroin, for example, they are going to go through horrible withdrawal symptoms. And they're going to go through under horrible withdrawal symptoms for at least a week because they're at that high dose. So you have to be really, really, really motivated to get any sort of high from the heroin, motivated enough to go through a week of hell in order to get better. Nobody does that. So people come back and they take their medication and they adhere and they stay clean on the treatment, and their behavior starts going back to normal. They go back to work, they start functioning, they take care of their families. They're on opiates, they're completely physically dependent, but it's not taking over their lives. Their behavior normalizes and they can function like normal people because people become tolerant to opiates like that. So highly, highly effective. And once people are on it, they stay stable generally. So two medications to do this. One is methadone, which is a very long-acting synthetic mu opiate. It also acts as a weak NMDA receptor antagonist. Don't worry about that, but basically it's a receptor that's involved in learning and memory, and which it's thought it may reduce development of tolerance a little bit. So you don't have to keep increasing dose over time. This was originally the only opiate agonist treatment available. It is highly regulated, so you can't just decide that you as a primary care physician are going to do methadone treatment with people. You have to have a special DEA licensed methadone clinic in order to prescribe methadone, and there are a whole variety of regulations about how frequently people have to come in for daily observed doses. They're coming in every day to get their treatment until they're stable for a given time, and then they can start taking home methadone in locked containers over a long time. And those treatment programs are supposed to provide psychosocial treatment services in conjunction with the medication. Nice part with all of the directly observed therapy, you're getting lots and lots of eyes on people. You can tell if they're getting better or not, and then you've got group therapy to go on with it. Very effective treatment model. The second type of treatment is buprenorphine. That can be delivered in the same way in a licensed clinic, but it's also allowed for office-based treatment. Anybody can prescribe it once they get a special waiver. So you have to go take, I think it's about an 8-hour training course to get your buprenorphine waiver, and then you can prescribe buprenorphine in any outpatient setting. So the reason for the greater regulation on methadone is, as I mentioned, it's very methadone's a full agonist. It's very easy to overdose on, particularly because it's so long-acting. Buprenorphine is a partial agonist at the mu opiate receptor. I mentioned this before. That means that you're only ever going to get partial effect, so it's harder to overdose. So if somebody else, at the really high doses that you prescribe methadone, if somebody else drinks your methadone, there's a good chance they're going to be dead, right? it's very, very important that you keep the methadone locked up and safe, right? And they do, in fact, they will not send it home not in a locked box. Buprenorphine's partial agonist, it only has partial effects, so you can fill up all the receptors while not having as great of an opioid effect. If somebody goes and takes somebody else's buprenorphine, chances are they live. That's the difference. That's the reason for the differences in regulation. Buprenorphine's also, it's also a kappa opiate receptor antagonist, which people, there's mixed data on how well it works, but some people say it reduces the dysphoria associated with withdrawal. So sometimes people use buprenorphine for detox management if you're trying to detox people. The data is kind of weak on whether it actually helps much. Buprenorphine is so because buprenorphine is a abusable medication that you could very easily shoot up, and it's very commonly abused, for example, in France, they made formulations, basically sublingual formulations, that include naloxone in the formulation. Naloxone's really poorly orally absorbed, so long as you take it the way you're supposed to, the naloxone does nothing, right? And you just get the buprenorphine effect. If you decided you wanted to inject your buprenorphine instead, it's mixed with naloxone. It won't do a thing because the naloxone will completely wipe out the effects of the buprenorphine. Yeah. Snorting will still, the naloxone will still block it. I've never heard of anyone smoking their buprenorphine, but I'm sure somebody's figured that out. So I don't know the answer to that one. Yes. These are morphine. So these will act on the mu and delta opiate receptors. But they would in fact activate your D1 and so they would activate your reward systems if you got them in fast enough. But the idea is you're stabilizing dose so much that you don't activate those reward systems, so you don't get dopamine receptor activation. Okay. So just to give you a sense, methadone dosing, maintenance doses, general guidelines are that it's only going to work probably at over 60 milligrams a day or greater. You shouldn't start with a dose of higher than 30 milligrams, and you need to titrate up slowly over weeks. Again, the nice thing about this is you're going to see the patient every single day, so you can tell if people are getting oversedated. There are a lot of methadone drug interactions. I'm not going to go through them. Some of the complicating parts of it are they interact a lot with the antiretrovirals, which can increase and decrease effects. So, if you're dealing with HIV-infected patients with opiate use disorders, you got to pay attention. That's bigger issue with heroin addicts than prescription opiate addicts, but just something to be aware of. Also, methadone can interact with other drugs. It does prolong QT interval and can interact with other drugs that do, causing risk of sudden death. And sedative drugs will also interact to increase respiratory depression. Dosing guidelines for Suboxone or Subutex. I guess this is one of those obvious things, but I'm just going to point it out because we've seen people make mistakes. You can't put somebody on naltrexone and buprenorphine at the same time because naltrexone's an antagonist and buprenorphine's an antagonist. Again, just want to make sure you're not co-prescribing benzos or other sedatives because they will interact and create sedation. The other main treatment is naltrexone for opiate addiction, and this does the exact opposite thing. So naltrexone's an opiate agonist. You put it on, it will jam the receptor in the off position, essentially. So you can get no signaling because the receptors are off. This has in the past, it was all done with oral formulation, and it wasn't anywhere near as effective as opiate agonist treatment because all you had to do to get high was not take your dose in the morning, and then you could go get high and go take the dose again later afterwards if you wanted to. So medication adherence was a serious problem, and it didn't really work very well. And oral Oral naltrexone is still not a recommended treatment for opiate addiction for that reason. But there's now a long-acting injectable formulation which lasts for 1 to 3 months. And so you can, if you can get people there, it's effective so long as you can get them to come back and get their monthly treatment, which is a heck of a lot easier than getting them to adhere once a day. So this is an effective alternative if you have people who don't want to be on opiates. One thing I'll point out just quickly, one of the downsides of being on opiate therapy long term is it does have endocrine effects and can cause sexual dysfunction, which is not always everyone's favorite side effect. So the naltrexone is a good option for people who just really don't want to be on opiate agonist treatment. And I would say, so if I had somebody who was less, who I was less scared about, who I thought was less chronic and more likely to be compliant with treatment, this is probably the preferable treatment for that reason. If you have somebody you're worried about treatment compliance, I would go with the agonist treatment. Again, we've talked a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy. Highly effective, should be offered in conjunction with your medication-assisted treatment. That being said, there's all sorts of other effective psychosocial treatments, including ACT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which sort of take cognitive behavioral therapy and add on to mindfulness and acceptance-based components. So helps people not react to feeling states immediately. 12-step facilitation, very highly effective, basically a model where you help walk people through and engage with 12-step treatment, so Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous type treatment. It has quite frankly, when you break it down, they do very, very similar things behaviorally as you do in cognitive behavioral therapy. And the nice thing is mutual help groups are free. And so if you have patients who can't afford formal treatment, it can be very, very, very good option. So the nice thing about addiction treatment is lack of money is never an excuse. And all of those psychosocial treatments have similar efficacy when compared in head-to-head trials. So choice of treatment is based on preference and availability. Really, one does not beat the other. The last two things I'm just going to mention really quick before we can leave, because there are 2 treatments that have been shown to add to the effectiveness of other psychosocial treatments for substance use disorder. One is behavioral couples therapy, and the idea basically takes cognitive behavioral therapy and it adds to it couples sessions where the point is to train the loved one to first avoid criticizing person for their substance use habits, because then what that does, when you criticize someone's substance use habits, you then makes the other person mad. They'll want to punish the person that just criticized them, and all they have to do is use, which is what they wanted to do anyway, in order to make you more mad. So criticism and confrontation have been shown to increase substance use. But so what they do is they teach them to ignore the bad behaviors and focus on recovery-focused activities. So help the person do things instead of substance use. Help them go to their mutual help groups. Help them get back to work. Facilitate all the good things they're doing and ignore the bad stuff. And this both adds on to treatment effectiveness by about 10%, and it improves relationships. It's one of the few things that has been shown to reduce spousal abuse, which is kind of interesting. Contingency management, I talked about briefly. The idea here is you're going to provide rewards, explicit rewards for abstinence or recovery-focused activities. And here you just set down make a plan that if you do this, if you meet this goal, you will get X reward. And this has been done in a lot of substance use clinics, either just by giving people money or a voucher or drawing from a prize lottery or even just a gold star on a public board. It doesn't have to be a big deal, but if you give people recognition and reinforcement for doing for doing things that are not easy to do, like staying abstinent or doing the thing you're scared of, it does substantially increase the likelihood that happens. Some tricky things about that. So people have found lotteries are just as effective as actual paying people. So you can make these cheap programs if you want to go the money route. And this has been used really commonly to address stimulant and sedative abuse in combination. So people who are using cocaine or benzodiazepines on top of their opiates. Key things here, this only works if the patient experiences the reward, so you gotta come up with goals that they can meet. So at times I've seen this not work. If you set an impossible goal so the patient can never get the reward, then they're gonna ignore your program pretty quick. So you gotta come up with things that they can do. You don't ever wanna do contingent punishments. You don't wanna do if you aren't abstinent, then this bad thing will happen to you. I've seen places that even did like, I'm going to drop your drug dose. Speaking of the punishment, we will taper you if you don't do X, Y, or Z. That makes them drop out of treatment. I mean, not to... not so much. I mean, he's done more motivational interviewing pieces. This is... oh, I'm blanking on their names right now, but I can get you the references if you'd like. This. Mm-hmm.
The idea of the extrinsic rewards and the monetary rewards are kind of new to me.
Yeah, so this is one of those very well studied, very rarely implemented substance use treatments, because what you find is most places go, I don't have any money to give out rewards in my healthcare system, even though it's like incredibly cost effective. They're not going to give me money to give to people with substance use problems. And so it's been very rarely implemented, but it is highly effective. So if you can, it's the sorting out the logistics that tends to be hard on this, because people tend to be edgy about it. Other obvious thing, so the rewards have to be consistent, and you need to provide them as soon as possible after the target behavior. So the more you can make it I'm going to do point of care drug testing, pee in this cup, I'll know in 10 minutes if you were abstinent on cocaine, and if you were, I'm going to give you your reward right there. The more you can bring the reward proximal to the behavior, the better. Okay, so we passed time, so I apologize for that. I'm going to go quickly just through a summary and then I'll let you go. So basically, first, opiate analgesics, they're not all bad, right? They have properties that could make them very useful tools to manage pain and recovery. This is, the opiates are inherently evil, not true. That being said, they also have properties that can encourage development of habits, including persistence of chronic pain, relief seeking that could keep them stuck in bad places. It can get them to focus on that rather than focusing on recovery focused behaviors. And in that, behavioral reshaping can happen not just in people with chronic pain, but all of the people that they interact with. And all of that part there can worsen and maintain pain and really put people at risk of addiction. So not that the drugs are bad, but there's so many ways that it can go wrong. You've got to be really careful and intentional about what you're doing, and not just, this is not the medication where you go, I have the diagnosis and I'm going to give the pill and assume that it's always going to work the same way. How this medication is used is just as important as what drug you give and what the patient's pain condition is. So without intentional focus to enable and reinforce recovery behaviors, patients tend to default to the worst possible use, which is using to cope instead of using to get better. So you gotta be really intentional about what you're doing. So I think about opiates to some extent as like cookies, right? So cookies, you can use cookies to shape behavior in amazing ways. Like anyone who's ever trained a dog can tell you that the cookies can be miracle workers, right? You can do all sorts of amazing things. But left to their own devices, if you give people a bunch of cookies, they're not going to go they're not going to learn wonderful things and take themselves in good directions. They're going to overeat them when they get stressed or for recreation and wind up overweight. So opiates are just the same way. You've got to use them intentionally and with a plan, with effective systems in place to structure their use, or they're not going to wind up good. So these are just some suggestions. Taking that cookie analogy, what can you do to use opiate safely in healthcare? Well, think about the things you do to control your cookie use, right? You could just say, I'm never going to eat cookies, they're evil. And I've seen people who've gone that route and they find other ways of working with patients on pain management and they can get by very effectively. Most people, not the way they go, but it's one way you could go. Other things, you want to make other options easier, right? So if you want to not eat the cookies in the house, you want to stock your house with all sorts of healthy things you want to eat instead. Same idea in your healthcare system. You need to make the other options easier. You want to ensure access to non-opiate pharmacotherapy, PT, and occupational therapy, and exercise, and interventional pain medicine, so that those are easier to do than the opiates. You want to slow down your decisions, right? Like, I never buy cookies because I eat them all. But I don't not have cookies. I just make myself make them, or I have to go take a special trip to the store. It's a pain. It's really big pain. So it's special. You want to do the same thing with opiates. Slow yourself down. Make it hard to do. You want to focus on goals. So decide when do I deserve a cookie, and what are you trying to do with these opiates? What are your functional goals, and how are you going to get there? And you need to pre-plan your use. You don't just decide you're going to decide when you need them. You got to plan what you're doing, plan your maximum dose, plan your trial, plan your exit strategy before you go. And then I think this is all. So you need to address risk of overdose, address and abuse, treat abuse and addiction, and then the main goal is maintaining treatment alliance. So work with your patient. Even if you get to a bad place, you both probably got there out of intent to get better. The patient didn't want to stay sick, and you didn't want them to stay sick. You were both on the same page when you started. Just because things went bad doesn't mean you shouldn't stay on the same page before. You really just got to focus on bringing back treatment alliance and work together on getting to a better place. And really, acknowledge and respect the humanity and the behavioral tendencies of both yourself and your patients. Don't get mad about it. Don't get stressed. Don't get anxious. But plan, because we're all going to drift in bad ways. Okay, and that's it. And I'll stay here for a little bit if people have questions. But thank you.